Imagine waking up to the realization that your private whispers, your daily movements, and even your future thoughts are being logged by an invisible observer. This level of surveillance was a matter of official government policy for millions of people in the 20th century. State agencies were built specifically to keep their populations under a permanent, watchful eye. These organizations functioned differently than standard law enforcement. While a typical police force is tasked with protecting citizens, a secret police force exists to secure the regime and maintain a grip on power. Under these systems, there were no fair trials or public hearings. Stepping out of line meant you simply vanished, removed from society without explanation or a trace. These agencies prioritized state stability over individual rights. They secured the government's authority by identifying, and often inventing, the very enemies they claimed to be hunting. History's most notorious examples of this system include the Nazi Gestapo and the Soviet KGB. But their success presents a logistical mystery. How did these regimes monitor and control millions of people before the invention of the internet, GPS tracking devices, or high-definition security cameras? It is physically impossible to police a mass population through brute force alone. Attempting to watch every citizen using only standing armies or massive squads of soldiers is too expensive and inefficient for any state to maintain. Instead, these regimes utilized the power of unpredictability. They made the rules of behavior and the resulting punishments appear random, ensuring that no citizen ever knew exactly where the line was drawn. By making the consequences of dissent both severe and unpredictable, the state forced its citizens into a psychological corner where they were compelled to police themselves. The modern blueprint for this control was developed in Imperial Russia by an organization called the Okhrana. On the surface, the Okhrana performed standard intelligence work. They embedded spies in political circles and kept files on known activists. The Okhrana's innovation was active provocation. They funded fake revolutionary groups to lure in dissidents, turning resistance into traps. When citizens discover trusted allies are state agents, safety is shattered. They lose the ability to distinguish friends from informants. This strategy of controlling the opposition, rather than merely arresting it, became the foundation for how later totalitarian regimes would systematically dismantle human trust. This cycle is the engine of the secret police. Surveillance generates information, creating fear, resulting in total control. As fear intensifies, citizens become informers to prove loyalty. This increases the flow of information back into surveillance, making the machine self-sustaining. This archival evidence shows how the state physically intruded into private life. Letters were intercepted, read, and blacked out by censors before they could even reach their destination. The Gestapo and the KGB expanded this reach by weaponizing personal relationships. They relied on ordinary people to report on their own neighbors, friends, and family members. Imagine a classroom where the teacher punishes students at random and encourages everyone to secretly report on their peers. The students will stop talking, stop questioning, and focus entirely on survival. This is psychological warfare applied to an entire nation. The ultimate result is self-censorship. The state no longer needs a guard on every corner because the citizen's mind takes over and regulates itself. This strategy relies on brutal efficiency. By punishing a small, random selection of the population, the state spreads terror through the millions who remain, convincing them that any slip-up could be fatal. The true strength of a secret police force is its invisibility. When you cannot identify the informant in the room, you cannot trust anyone. And a society without trust is a society that cannot organize. This creates a world of forced isolation. People whisper in their own homes, avoid eye contact in public, and carefully filter every word to ensure they stay within the regime's shifting boundaries. Absolute control is never established overnight. These systems are built slowly and quietly. By the time fear has completely replaced the truth, the architecture is finished, and the entire population is trapped within it. Secret police systems are built through a sequence of small, quiet administrative shifts. This methodical process allows the state to establish control long before it ever has to rely on open displays of force. That quiet evolution makes them so dangerous. People live their daily lives, failing to recognize the tightening net until escape is practically impossible. This establishes a core rule for totalitarian growth. Absolute control is built through incremental changes rather than sudden public announcements. Those conditions don't exist during times of peace. Secret police need intense societal chaos to thrive. When a nation suffers a severe crisis, like a devastating war, an economic collapse, or deep political instability, the government faces its ultimate fear, a complete loss of control. Look at this massive crowd protesting in Germany. After World War I, Europe was left fractured. Empires had fallen, economies were ruined, and the public was angry and confused about the future. If you are leading a country in that environment, you face a choice. You can try the slow, difficult process of fixing the systemic rot, or you can seize total control of the population immediately. To justify that rapid seizure of power, the government will frame their extreme actions as a strictly temporary measure to restore order. That temporary power grab almost never starts with illegal force. It begins with small, perfectly legal emergency decrees. In 1933, the German parliament building, the Reichstag, burned down. The government blamed political enemies and used the crisis to legally strip away civilian rights. Overnight, privacy, free speech, and protection from arbitrary arrest were completely erased. The Soviet system was born from a similar environment. Following the Russian Revolution, the new government faced immense opposition and a brutal civil war, prompting them to create the Cheka, their first secret police force to crush the resistance gathering here. This timeline traces how that Soviet apparatus evolved. It grew over decades, moving from the Cheka to the GPU, then the NKVD, and finally the KGB, refining its methods and expanding its power at every step. You might wonder why a public would tolerate this. Citizens often support the systems designed to monitor them, driven by a mixture of fear and the hope for stability. Governments manufacture this consent by defining a clear existential enemy. If the public believes the threat is real, they will actively demand their own subjugation. That public support fuels the core engine of any secret police force. To watch everyone, the state relies on ordinary citizens to watch each other. This diagram shows how a society turns on itself. First, people are encouraged to report suspicious behavior and rewarded for doing so. Then, the definition of suspicious broadens. Failing to report a neighbor becomes a crime. The Gestapo didn't have enough agents to monitor the whole. Most investigations were actually initiated by civilian tips regarding minor offenses, like telling a joke or listening to foreign radio. The Soviet Union weaponized this localized paranoia even further. Citizens were encouraged to expose traitors, giving people a tool to settle personal grudges by sending their rivals to the gulag. These localized informant networks feed massive amounts of data upward, allowing the secret police to scale from small emergency task forces into massive multi-departmental intelligence agencies. A secret police force achieves its maximum power through the density of its surveillance web. When an organization is connected to every home and workplace, its actual headcount becomes secondary to its total reach. That inescapability leads to the final stage of systemic buildup. The extreme fear engineered by the state eventually becomes a normal part of everyday life. This sequence illustrates the psychological degradation of the public. What begins as shock at extreme state actions slowly erodes into paralyzing fear, then silent compliance, and finally an apathetic drive to simply survive. The system achieves victory the moment someone vanishes in the middle of the night and their neighbors feel no outrage. Chaos provides the opening. Laws grant the power. The public consents. The informers build the network. The system expands. And the fear becomes normal. The foundation is complete. And once the psychological foundation is established, the secret police expand their mandate to include direct physical intervention. Surveillance now serves as the intelligence layer for aggressive enforcement. The bureaucratic machine now initiates mass arrests. Interrogation and systematic torture become standard procedure, and entire populations find themselves targeted for elimination. The methodical manipulation of the public mind has done its job. It has paved the way for the raw reality of state terror, where the victims are left to face the consequences in the dark. Secret police systems are always predictable outcomes. They are the logical result of specific human tendencies and societal conditions that appear repeatedly throughout history. When society is saturated with fear, the population shifts towards obedience. When that meets unchecked authority, a control machine is born. This fusion creates a self-sustaining cycle. Resistance vanishes, leaders face no limits, and state control expands. This mechanism is a latent threat in any society. We see it clearly in the 20th century, but the pattern is not limited to any single era or geography. The boot-up sequence begins the moment a government requests more authority in exchange for safety. That trade is the friction sparking the entire engine. Totalitarianism is a mechanical result. It is what happens when unchecked fear meets unchecked authority. Resistance fails early because the first steps are invisible. Controls are introduced through small, incremental laws that seem reasonable, necessary, and most importantly, temporary. A single law is a drop of water. It is barely noticed. A second law follows, then a third. Eventually, these individual decrees coalesce. They reach a tipping point where they become a flood, a massive, unified apparatus that citizens can no longer escape. Total control. It is comforting to believe these systems require a nation of monsters to function. The reality is much more unsettling. After World War II, philosopher Hannah Arendt introduced the concept of the banality of evil. She argued that the most terrifying systems are not run by villains, but by people who are simply doing their jobs. The machine relied on the mundane ambitions of ordinary citizens, clerks, informers, and neighbors who were looking for rewards, safety, or simply a way to avoid drawing suspicion to themselves. The system's true power lies in its ability to turn routine, everyday tasks into the essential gears of mass oppression. In the past, the secret police required physical dominance. They needed massive headquarters and thousands of human eyes on the street. Modern technology has removed the need for human informants. AI, location tracking, and automated surveillance provide a degree of oversight that analog systems could only dream of. The danger today is the invisibility of the threat. When the environment itself is the informer, citizens never truly know if they are being monitored. This uncertainty leads to the final stage of the control machine, the transition from external force to internal control. Self-censorship eventually evolves into something deeper. To feel safe, citizens begin to actively align their own thoughts with the state's requirements. The machine achieves total victory when the state no longer needs to use force. The population has internalized the oppression, effectively policing their own minds. If these systems were dismantled, freedom would return, but it often brings a period of instability and chaos. This trade-off is why many societies tolerate a high degree of control. Resistance against the Gestapo or the KGB was rare because rebellion requires two things: communication and coordination. Those elements rely on a single foundation: trust. You must trust your neighbor shares your goals and won't betray you. This is why secret police sever human connections. By seeding doubt, they make organization impossible. A population that cannot trust itself cannot resist. Dictators are only the catalysts for these systems. The true danger is that the underlying variables, fear, authority, and human compliance, are universal. Because these conditions can align in any era, history repeats its patterns, even as the technology and the faces change. Even when these oppressive machines fall, they leave deep generational scars. The erosion of trust and the habits of suspicion remain, defining how millions of people relate to power, to truth, and to each other. Up to this point, we've examined the high-level blueprints of political power, but studying the architecture of a regime leaves out the human reality. We need to look closely at what it actually felt like to live entirely at the mercy of the state. Imagine your house. It's well past midnight. The street is silent. Everyone is asleep. And suddenly, a slow, heavy knock echoes from the front door. In both Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, secret police units chose to execute warrants in the dead of night. It ensured their targets were exhausted, completely disoriented, and isolated from anyone who might offer help. Opening the door to that sound meant stepping across a permanent threshold. Your previous life ended the moment the handle turned. These apprehensions stripped away all standard legal protections. There were no Miranda rights, no formal list of charges, and absolutely no opportunity to call a defense attorney. Look at this photograph of Adolf Hitler and Nazi officials processing official paperwork. It highlights the cold, bureaucratic reality of the Gestapo and KGB. The arrest was never the precursor to a trial. The arrest was the punishment. The pipeline was ruthlessly simple. A resentful neighbor files a verbal report. Your name goes into a ledger. A low-level clerk reviews the entry. A decision is stamped without investigation, and a van is dispatched to your address. The accusations scrawled in these case files were completely arbitrary. You could be pulled in for wrong attitude or suspicious behavior, crimes so vague you couldn't possibly provide evidence to disprove them. Innocence offered exactly zero protection. The state didn't require proof of a crime to pull you out of your bed. They only required the faintest trace of suspicion. Once inside a holding facility, the goal of an interrogation was never to uncover the truth. The entire process was engineered to break the prisoner and manufacture compliance. The physical environment functioned as a weapon. Prisoners were locked away in windowless concrete rooms, starved, deprived of sleep for days on end, and forced to stare into blinding lights to degrade their cognitive resistance. Then the interrogators introduced psychological variables. They would claim your spouse had already provided a full confession, or they would slide a forged document across the table proving your guilt. By systematically severing a prisoner's ties to reality, the interrogator forced them to rely entirely on the state for the truth. When a person can no longer trust their own memory, their will collapses. People regularly sign confessions to crimes they never committed. When you haven't slept in 72 hours and your mind is fracturing, the immediate, agonizing pain of the present easily overrides the abstract threat of a prison sentence in the future. Targeting individual dissidents eventually became too slow for totalitarian regimes. To scale their control, the secret police began hunting entire demographic categories through massive, coordinated operations. In Nazi Germany, the net swept up Jews, journalists, and intellectuals. Look at this portrait of Joseph Stalin. Under his paranoid regime during the Great Purge, the KGB targeted military officers, ordinary citizens, and even incredibly loyal party members. This animation illustrates their most chilling bureaucratic innovation, the quota system. Regional directors received mandatory targets to arrest 100 enemies by the month's end. To avoid missing their numbers, officers arbitrarily dragged innocent people off the street. Finding actual criminals became irrelevant. Look at these men sitting strictly on bunks inside a wooden barracks. This was one of 3 potential destinations for the arrested. You were either packed into temporary holding facilities, sent to freeze and work until you collapsed in the labor camps of the Gulag, or marched straight to an unrecorded execution. Adopting manufacturing targets for human lives strips a justice system of all remaining empathy. People are no longer treated as citizens. They become raw materials consumed to maintain state infrastructure. The violence inflicted on the arrested served a secondary, much larger purpose. When that belief takes root, the state achieves the ultimate form of control. Citizens begin to censor, monitor, and police themselves. The tools of surveillance have evolved drastically since the 20th century, but the human mind remains vulnerable to the exact same methods of isolation and fear. Let's return to where we started: a quiet night, a silent house, and a sudden knock on the door. But that knock does not happen in isolation. It is the final culmination of a deep structural shift in a society. It is the physical result of a system built, step by step, from 3 specific materials: fear, power, and silence. What we are looking at through all these historical accounts is a recurring algorithm of human behavior. The core mechanic relies on taking mundane situations and tightening them, degree by degree, until everyday life becomes an instrument of absolute control. This timeline maps exactly how that progression works. A society slips from normal life, through small changes, into fear, before eventually ending up under total subjugation in the control box. It is incredibly tempting to look back at that process and tell ourselves that it belongs to a different, less enlightened era, that it couldn't possibly happen to us. The people in this photograph are ordinary citizens. They are being herded into a Ruba truck while a crowd of their neighbors stands in the street and watches. We see the imposing facade of the KGB's Lubyanka melding, and we focus heavily on the architecture of state surveillance. We look at the concrete and the steel. By treating these regimes as distant relics, we ignore the mechanics of how they were built, leaving the door completely open for the same methods to take root today. A modern surveillance state will never arrive wearing the exact same uniforms as the ones we read about in textbooks. The tactics evolve to fit the era, the technology updates, and the propaganda gets a new coat of paint. But the underlying operating system of fear and control runs exactly as it always has. We often tell ourselves that extreme oppression requires an all-powerful leader, like Adolf Hitler, to force a nation into submission. Or we point to figures like Joseph Stalin, blaming the sheer force of their personalities for the millions who suffered. The uncomfortable reality is that those figureheads could accomplish nothing without the slow, daily adaptation of the societies they ruled. This diagram of a crossroads shows why. When faced with the risky path of speaking out, or the brightly lit, heavily worn path of staying silent, the vast majority of people will naturally choose the illusion of safety. That is why the lethal threat of an emerging secret police state lies entirely in its agonizingly slow implementation. It relies on citizens telling themselves, "It's just this once," or "It's necessary for safety," to rationalize giving up tiny fractions of their rights. Small justifications function as stepping stones. A minor compromise here, a small law there. They connect to form a one-way path. By the final stone, you are in an environment devoid of trust, where neighbors surveil neighbors, and silence is survival. The entire apparatus of a police state is simply a massive prison constructed from millions of tiny, individual decisions to avoid friction. So ask yourself, if you were living in the early days of those regimes, would you actually recognize the signs? Would you possess the courage to speak out when the cost was high, or would you retreat into the safety of silence? The historical record is entirely unforgiving on this point. The vast majority of populations remain completely blind to the trap until the mathematical probability of escape reaches zero. Breaking this cycle requires hypervigilant, informed awareness. Studying the internal mechanics of how these systems operate is the mandatory first step to neutralizing them before they take root. That means paying close attention when you hear about new, expanding surveillance nets, or when authorities introduce so-called temporary control measures. You shouldn't panic when you see these symptoms, but you absolutely must refuse to ignore them. This graphic illustrates the reality. History does not sound alarms, it whispers. And while you are straining to hear it, the shadow behind it is quietly expanding. But if enough individuals intentionally listen for that whisper, the historical algorithm fails. The cycle breaks. Dissecting the history of the secret police reveals the broader mechanics of power and human behavior. An oppressive system has no intrinsic power of its own. It draws every ounce of its strength from the permission granted by ordinary people. The future is entirely unwritten. Whether we slide back into the dark or maintain our freedom depends entirely on what we are willing to question and the difficult choices we are willing to make today. When a secret police system finally collapses, the men who enforced the rules go home. The physical offices empty out, but the fear they engineered over decades does not disappear overnight. Imagine living for years in a reality where trusting the wrong person or saying the wrong thing could lead to your immediate disappearance. That level of caution wires itself deep into a person's behavior. A regime might fall in a single afternoon. Its monuments can be torn down, and its capital can be crumbled to ash. Technically, the population is liberated, but the human mind does not accept that freedom right away. Long after organizations like the Gestapo and the KGB were legally dismantled, the people who survived their surveillance continued to carry the psychological weight of those systems. Out of pure habit, people still whispered in their own kitchens. They actively avoided subjects that used to be dangerous, and they hesitated before giving their opinions in public. Psychologists call this internalized control. The state no longer has to expend massive resources to watch you, because you are actively policing yourself. The most effective prison a state can build is one the citizens eventually maintain on their own, completely free of charge. That psychological toll happens inside the individual, but the methods used by these agencies tear at something much larger, the connective tissue between people. Totalitarian surveillance relies on turning the population into a vast network of informers. It requires coworkers to report on coworkers and neighbors to report on neighbors. This declassified dossier documents the bureaucratic reality of informant networks. When regimes fall, the files open. Citizens discover a close friend passed along private conversations to the state, or they live with the guilt of informing on others just to protect their own family. The immediate result is social fracture. People retreat inward. Relationships stay shallow, and communities lose cohesion. A nation can rebuild a bombed-out city block in months. Rebuilding the basic assumption that your neighbor means you no harm takes generations. Even as society struggles to heal socially, we have to look at what happens to the physical remnants of the secret police organizations themselves. Signing a piece of paper to legally dissolve an agency removes the name from the door, but it does not delete millions of specialized files, clear out established spy networks, or erase the expertise of thousands of trained operatives. When the Soviet Union collapsed, the KGB was officially broken apart, yet its methodologies, its massive archives, and a significant portion of its personnel simply transitioned into new roles under different acronyms. We see a similar pattern after the fall of Nazi Germany. The Gestapo was completely dismantled, but the sheer efficiency of its surveillance architecture heavily influenced how subsequent global intelligence agencies structured their own operations. This leaves recovering nations in a strange paradox. Authoritarian governments end, but the precise tools they built to monitor their populations embed themselves directly into the bedrock of the states that replace them. The exposure of these systems did provoke a massive coordinated response from the rest of the globe. In the years immediately following World War II, international lawmakers pivoted hard. They began aggressively drafting human rights protections and defining strict, non-negotiable limits on government overreach. The United Nations became the primary forum for this effort, pushing member states to legally guarantee the freedom of speech, the right to a fair trial, and absolute protection from unlawful arrest. These laws are highly specific, defensive countermeasures built directly in response to the historical trauma of unchecked state surveillance. They were never meant as random philosophical ideas. History functions as a warning system. The danger rarely announces itself with a sudden violent takeover. Instead, power expands in quiet increments, shaving away civil rights a fraction of an inch at a time. The mechanics of fear and the slow creep of surveillance are universal vulnerabilities. These patterns can take root anywhere if a society stops paying attention. The ultimate lesson from these fallen regimes is that total control rarely requires physical chains. It simply requires a population willing to enforce its own silence.